She did not slip. The ground had been dry. It's still morning. And her stepsister's hands had been on her back for exactly 3 seconds before Elowen Ashvale went over the edge. She did not scream. There was no time. Only the rush of cold air, the blur of white sky, and the sharp crack of rock against her palm as she clawed for anything to stop the fall. Then silence. Then a hand. Strong, certain, like it had always known she would be here. She looked up, breathless, her fingers locked around a wrist that held her weight without trembling, and the face staring down at her was not one she recognized. Hard jaw, dark eyes. A coat too fine for a man who spent his mornings catching women off cliffsides. He pulled her up slowly, said nothing for a long moment, and then just before she could find her voice, he looked back over his shoulder in the direction she had come from, where Lavinia still stood watching, and something shifted in his expression, something she could not yet name. He knew. He already knew. If you already have a feeling about where this is going, drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started. Elowen's knees hit the grass the moment he let go of her wrist. She did not fall from weakness. She chose the ground deliberately, the way a person does when their body has been through something their mind has not yet caught up with. Her palms pressed flat against the earth, cold and damp, and she breathed through her nose until the ringing in her ears began to fade. Her right hand was bleeding. She noticed it without feeling it. A long cut ran from her index finger down to her wrist, where the rock face had taken its price. She closed her fingers slowly, watching the way the blood gathered at the crease of her palm, and then she looked up. He was still there. He had taken 2 steps back, giving her space she had not asked for but was grateful for all the same. He stood with his hands at his sides, watching her the way one watches something fragile they are not sure they are allowed to touch again. His coat was deep grey, the kind of coat that did not belong on a cliffside path. His boots were muddied at the toe. He had been walking, then, not riding. That meant he had heard her fall before he saw it. She filed that away without knowing why. He was not young in the way boys are young, all softness and uncertainty. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with the kind of face that had been through weather, not rough, just settled, like he had made a decision about himself a long time ago and had not revisited it since. His jaw was sharp. His dark eyes had not moved from her face since he pulled her up, and there was nothing in them she could read with any confidence. Not pity, not surprise, not the performance of concern that men put on when they want something in return for a kindness. Just attention, quiet and absolute. She pushed herself to her feet. Her ankles screamed. She absorbed it, kept her face still, and straightened to her full height. She was not tall, but she had spent most of her 22 years learning how to take up space in rooms that did not want her, and she had gotten rather good at it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. He gave a single nod. "You are hurt. I am standing." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that knew what a smile was, and was choosing not to become one. Those are not the same thing. She looked down at her hand. The bleeding had slowed. "No," she agreed, "but one is more useful right now." She heard movement behind her and went still. Lavinia was coming down the path. She was taking her time. She always took her time when she had already done the damage she intended. She moved through the world like someone who had never once been made to rush. Her copper hair pinned high, her pale green walking dress entirely unaffected by the wind that had been tearing at Elowen's own hair for the past half hour. She was beautiful in the way that sharp things sometimes are, and she wore it like armour. She stopped a few feet away, and her eyes went to the stranger first. The calculation was instant and invisible to anyone who did not know her. Elowen knew her. "My goodness," Lavinia said, pressing one hand to the base of her throat. "Elowen, you gave me such a fright. One moment you were beside me, and the next." She shook her head, exhaling slowly, a portrait of a woman composing herself. "She has always been unsteady on uneven ground," she added, turning her gaze to the man with the expression of someone making a gentle, sorrowful confession. Elowen said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence was the only answer to Lavinia that did not hand her more material to work with. The man did not respond to Lavinia either. He looked at her the way one might look at a door that has been left open in a house where all the doors should be closed, brief, noting. Then he looked back at Elowen. "There is a house a quarter-mile from here," he said. "The path runs east from the fork below. You will want that hand seen to before the cold sets in." Lavinia stepped forward. "We have our own carriage waiting at—" "Yes," he said, without looking at her. "I am sure you do." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Lavinia smiled. It did not reach anything above her mouth. "I am sorry. I do not believe we have been introduced. I am Miss Lavinia Ashvale, and this is my stepsister." A pause, perfectly placed. "She tends to wander." He looked at Elowen once more, and this time there was something different in it, something that asked a question he was not going to voice here, in front of this woman, on this path. "Miss Ashvale," he said, and it was Elowen he was addressing, not Lavinia, a fact that would cost her later, and she knew it. "The offer stands." Then he turned and walked east, without waiting to see if she would follow. She stood for a moment. Lavinia's hand came to rest lightly on her arm, the touch soft enough that no stranger would find fault with it. "You are shaking," Lavinia murmured, close to her ear. "People will notice." Elowen removed her arm from her stepsister's grip, with the same quiet precision she used for everything. She had no sharp words left. She had spent her last sharp words 3 years ago, the night her father died and Lavinia's mother had stood in the doorway of his study and told Elowen, gently, that some arrangements had already been made. She had used every sharp word she owned that night, and had woken the next morning to find that none of them had changed a single thing. So she walked east. She did not look back at Lavinia. She did not need to. She could feel her watching. The path curved downward past a line of silver birch trees, and the sound of the wind changed as the cliff dropped away behind her. Her ankle was worse than she had let on. Each step sent a thin, insistent pain up through her leg that she measured in even intervals and refused to limp against. She was not going to limp in front of a stranger who had already seen her bleeding on the ground. She caught up to him where the path flattened. He was not walking quickly. He had slowed, without appearing to have done so, and she suspected he had done it deliberately. That irritated her, and she was grateful for it. Irritation was easier to carry than the other thing, the thing that had been pressing against the inside of her chest since the moment she felt Lavinia's hands. "I do not know your name," she said. He glanced sideways. "No." She waited. He let a beat pass that was just long enough to be deliberate. "Evander," he said. Just the one name, nothing attached to it. No title, no house, no family declaration. Just a word, offered plainly, as if he were testing what she would do with it. "Elowen," she returned, in the same tone. "I know." She looked at him sharply. He did not look back. He was watching the path ahead, his expression unchanged, his hands still easy at his sides. But there was something in the set of his jaw now that had not been there before, something tighter, something that belonged to a thought he had decided not to share yet. "You know my name," she said, and it was not a question. "I know a great many things," he said. "Most of them are inconvenient." She nearly stopped walking. She kept herself moving only because stopping would have meant he had surprised her, and she was not yet ready to give him that. "Such as?" she said. He said nothing for a long moment. The birch trees thinned. A low stone house came into view at the end of the path, smoke rising from its chimney, warm light in the window. "Such as the fact," he said quietly, "that you did not slip." Elowen kept her eyes forward. Her hand was throbbing, her ankle was burning, and somewhere behind her, a quarter-mile back, Lavinia was walking to a carriage and telling herself that the morning had gone the way mornings go. She had no idea who this man was. She had no idea why he was here, or how he knew her name, or what he meant to do with what he had seen. But he had said it plainly, without flinching, without the careful softness people used when they were not sure you could bear the truth. And that, more than anything, was the thing she could not stop thinking about as they walked together in silence toward the warmth of that small and ordinary door. The inside of the house was smaller than it looked from the path. A single room served as both sitting area and kitchen, with a narrow wooden table pushed against the far wall and 2 chairs angled toward a fireplace that had been burning long enough to take the chill from the stone floor. There was no servant present. No one came to the door when Evander pushed it open. He simply walked in, crossed to a low cabinet beside the hearth, and began pulling out a folded cloth and a ceramic bowl without asking permission or offering explanation. Elowen stood in the doorway. She had been inside houses that were not hers before. She had stood in rooms where she was tolerated rather than welcomed, and had learned the particular art of making herself small enough to be forgotten and useful enough to be kept. But this felt different. This house had no audience. No one watching to see whether she stood correctly or spoke correctly or arranged her face into something palatable. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. He gestured to the nearer chair without looking at her. She sat because her ankle had run out of patience with her pride and had decided to make the decision for her. He brought the bowl to the table, filled it from a jug of water that had been sitting near the fire, and then pulled the second chair around to face her rather than sitting across the room. He crouched slightly, took her hand before she could offer it, and began cleaning the cut with the kind of efficiency that did not ask whether she was ready. She watched his hands. They were careful, not gentle in the way that meant uncertain, but careful in the way that meant practiced. He had done this before, tending to something that was damaged, keeping his own reaction out of it. There was a small scar along his left knuckle that she noticed without meaning to. Another along the inside of his wrist, older, the skin faded silver. She looked away from it. "You are not from the village," she said. "No. Then what are you doing on this path?" He pressed the cloth against her palm and held it there with light, even pressure. "Walking. People walk paths they know. Some people walk paths precisely because they do not know them." She looked at him then. He was focused on her hand, his head slightly bent, and she had a moment to study him without his eyes on her. The line of his jaw, the way his brow sat low and still, not furrowed, not performing thought, just present. He did not carry himself like a man who needed rooms to go quiet when he entered them. He carried himself like a man who had long since stopped needing rooms to notice him at all. That told her more than his name had. "You said you know me," she said. "I said I know your name. Those are not the same thing." He looked up. The corner of his mouth shifted, and this time it came closer to a smile than it had before. "No," he said, "they are not." He released her hand and sat back. The cut had been cleaned and bound with a strip of cloth that was tighter than strictly necessary, firm enough that the throbbing dulled to something manageable. She flexed her fingers experimentally and did not wince, which felt like a small personal victory. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had picked up. She had been sitting with the question of him ever since the cliff, turning him over the way one turns over something found on the ground that does not match the landscape. He had appeared at exactly the right moment. He had said exactly the right thing. He had known her name and had not explained how, and she had let it go twice now because the situation had not permitted her to press, and she was done letting it go. "How do you know my name?" she said. It was not phrased as a question this time. He was quiet for a moment. He set the cloth down, looked at the fire, and then looked back at her with an expression she could not fully decipher. It was the expression of a man who had arrived at a door He had planned to approach differently and was now deciding, in real time, whether to change his approach or hold to the original plan. "Your father," he said, "was Edmund Ashvale." The name landed in the room the way names of the dead always do, too present for someone so absent. She did not let anything show. Yes, he was a good man. She said nothing. She agreed, and she did not trust herself to say so plainly, so she said nothing at all. "I knew him," Evander said. "Briefly. Several years ago, when I was in the north on business. We shared a table at an inn during a bad storm. He talked about you." He paused. "He talked about you the way men talk about the one thing they are most afraid of failing." Elowen looked down at her bound hand. Her father had been dead for 3 years. He had died on a Tuesday in late October. In the study, he had spent most of her childhood filling with books. He never quite found the time to read, and he had died not knowing what Lavinia's mother had already arranged. She believed that. She had to believe that, because the alternative was a grief she had no room for. Edmund Ashvale had been a man of good intentions and poor judgment, which is perhaps the most dangerous combination a father can possess. He had trusted the wrong woman with his comfort in the years after Elowen's mother died, and that trust had cost his daughter everything he had built: the house, the small income. The name that had once opened doors now attached to a step-family that used it as leverage and offered nothing in return. She had been 19 when he died. She had been 19, and suddenly dependent, and she had learned the shape of that dependency, the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark, by running into its edges until you know exactly where they are. "He should not have told a stranger about me," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He was not entirely sober," Evander said, "and the storm was very bad." She laughed before she could stop herself. It came out short and surprised, the kind of laugh that arrives before grief has finished leaving the room, and she pressed her lips together after it and looked back at the fire. He did not say anything. He let the laugh exist without commenting on it, which was the right thing to do, and which she suspected he knew was the right thing to do. She had not laughed about her father in a long time. She had not laughed about much, if she was honest. The house she lived in now, Lavinia's mother's house, was a place where laughter required an audience, and an audience required a reason, and the reasons offered to Elowen were always at her expense. She thought about the cliff. She had not allowed herself to think about it directly since it happened. She had been processing the way she always processed, in slivers, not looking at the whole thing, taking in the edges first. The dry ground, the stillness, the fact that Lavinia had positioned herself on the uphill side of the path, which was unusual, because Lavinia disliked exertion and the uphill side required more. She had noticed it and not noticed it, the way you do when your mind refuses to complete a thought you are not ready to have. Lavinia had put her hands on her back. It had not been a shove in the way stories describe shoves. It had been a press, steady and deliberate, the kind of push that would look, from any distance, like a steadying touch that had simply gone wrong. Lavinia was too intelligent for clumsiness and too careful for anger. Whatever she had done, she had planned it. And she had planned it the way she planned everything, with a surface that held no fingerprints. Elowen knew this, and knowing it made not a single difference, because there was no one to tell it to. There was no one in that house whose account would be believed over Lavinia's, no servant loyal enough to risk their position, no family member whose interest did not begin and end with keeping Lavinia's mother comfortable. Except now there was this man who had seen what he had seen and had said so plainly on a path in the cold. She looked at him. He was watching her with that same still attention, not pressing, not filling the silence with himself the way people do when silence makes them anxious. He sat with it the way you sit with weather, accepting its presence, not asking it to leave. "Why did you say it?" she asked. He did not ask what she meant, because it was true. Saying true things is not always wise. "No," he agreed. "It rarely is." "Then why?" He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, his eyes on her face. The firelight moved between them. "Because," he said, "some truths become dangerous the longer they go unsaid. And I have found that once you identify that kind, it is better to say them early and deal with the consequences than to wait and discover the cost of your silence when it is too late to recover it." She held his gaze. There was something underneath his words that she could not reach yet. A context she was missing, a frame she did not have. He had come to this path with a reason she had not yet been given, and he was not hiding it exactly, but he was holding it back, the way you hold a card back, not from deception, but from timing. He was waiting for something. She did not yet know what. "You know my name," she said slowly, "and you knew my father, and you were on that path this morning." She paused. "That is a great deal of coincidence." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said simply. "It is." And he said nothing more. She wanted to push. Every part of her that had learned to survive by paying attention was pulling toward the question that was now sitting directly between them, visible and unasked. But she was also cold, and her ankle was swelling inside her boot, and she had just gone over the edge of a cliff and been pulled back by a man who said he had known her father and would not tell her anything else at a pace she chose. So she sat with it. She sat with it and watched the fire and listened to the wind change direction outside the window, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the morning had not gone the way someone else had planned. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. She stayed longer than she intended. That was the first thing she admitted to herself when she finally stood to leave, testing her weight on her ankle and finding it bearable if she was careful. She had not meant to sit by that fire for as long as she had. She had not meant to let the warmth settle into her the way it did, or to find herself talking about things she had not spoken aloud in years. Not important things, small ones. The way her father had taken his tea. The name of the dog they'd had when she was a child that had been quietly rehomed after his death. Ordinary things, gone. Evander had listened without collecting the information. That was the only way she could describe it. Some people listen, and you can see them storing what you say, filing it, deciding what it means about you. He listened like someone who understood that some things are said not to be remembered, but simply to be released. She did not know what to do with a man like that. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she would leave this house and walk back to the road and find the carriage that Lavinia had waiting, and she would sit in it with her hands folded and her face composed, and she would say nothing for the duration of the ride home. She was good at that. She had become very good at that. She reached for her coat, and he spoke. "There is something I need to tell you." She stopped. He had moved to the window while she was gathering herself, and he stood with his back to the room, looking out at the grey sky. His shoulders were set in a way that told her he had been deciding whether to say this for some time. "Then say it," she said. He turned from the window. He did not sit. He stood with the firelight behind him and looked at her with an expression that had changed from everything she had seen before. It was not closed. It was not the careful, measuring look he had worn since the cliff. It was something more direct and more serious, and it made the room feel smaller. "Your father's estate," he said. "The house, the land, the accounts he held. You believe it passed to your stepmother through the terms of his will." She felt something tighten in her chest. "That is what I was told." "You were told correctly. Partially." He paused. "There was a second document, written 3 months before your father died. I have reason to believe it was never filed. And I have reason to believe that the reason it was never filed was not your father's decision." The room was very quiet. She kept her face still through practice and nothing else. "What kind of document?" "A revision," he said. "One that would have left the primary estate, the house and the land, to you directly. Not in trust, not through a guardian. To you, in your own name, with full legal standing." She heard what he was saying. She heard every word of it and understood each one individually, but the shape of them together was too large to hold all at once. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that my father changed his will." "I am telling you that he wrote a revision. Whether it constitutes a valid legal will depends on the filing, which is where the matter becomes complicated." "Where is it?" "That is what I have been trying to determine." She looked at him. "For how long?" He met her eyes. 8 months. 8 months. He had been looking for this for 8 months. He had known her father, had heard something, or found something, or been told something, and he had spent 8 months following it to this path, to this cliff, to this morning. The coincidence she had named earlier was not a coincidence at all. She sat back down. Not because her ankle demanded it this time, but because she needed the chair under her while she reassembled her understanding of the past 3 years. "You were looking for me," she said. "I was looking for the document. Finding you was—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Finding you in the circumstances I found you in was not part of the plan." She thought about Lavinia's hands on her back. She thought about the dry ground and the still morning and the calculated gentleness of the push. She thought about the timing of it, the walk that Lavinia had suggested the evening before, so casually, a morning walk along the cliff-top path. It would do Elowen good to have some air. The revision would have left everything to her. If there was any chance Lavinia's mother knew of it, any chance at all that she had intercepted the filing and understood what it meant, then Elowen alive and searching was a problem. Elowen at the bottom of a cliff was a solution. She pressed her bound hand flat against her knee and breathed. "You should have come to me sooner," she said, and her voice came out harder than she expected. Not at him, exactly, at the 8 months, at the 3 years before that, at all the time she had spent making herself small in a house that had been hers. "I was not certain," he said. "I did not want to bring you something half-built. And now? Now I am more certain. And now," he said, with a look that acknowledged what had happened on that path, without either of them having to say it again, "I believe the situation has changed." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had known her father, who had spent 8 months on a question he did not have to ask, who had been walking a path he did not know, and had caught her before she understood she was falling. She wanted to trust him. That was the honest thing. She wanted to take everything he had just said and hold it like something that could save her, because she was tired, and she had been tired for a very long time. And she had forgotten what it felt like to have something in her corner. But she had also trusted the shape of her father's world, and that world had been rearranged without her knowledge. She had trusted the stability of a morning walk, and that had nearly killed her. She had learned, at considerable cost, that the distance between a thing appearing safe and a thing being safe was exactly the distance that could ruin you. "Who are you?" she said. "Your full name, all of it." He was quiet for just a beat too long. "Evander Croft," he said, "the Duke of Aldenmere." She had not seen that coming. She did not show that she had not seen it coming, but she had not, and it rearranged the room in a way she had to adjust to quietly and quickly. A duke. He had given her one name on the path, like a man with nothing attached to him, and he was a duke. She thought about the coat, the bearing, the way he had looked at Lavinia, with that brief, closing expression, the look of someone deciding a person's worth and finding it wanting. She thought about the way he had cleaned her hand, without hesitation, without the careful distance that men of consequence usually kept from the inconveniences of others. She kept her face even. "You could have said so on the path." "You were bleeding," he said. A title felt like poor timing. She stood again, slowly, and this time she put her coat on. She needed to move. She needed to be in motion while she thought, and she could not think clearly while she was sitting in his chair by his fire, in a house that she now understood was probably not a random shelter, but something he had known about. Probably his own. "The document," she said, buttoning her coat with deliberate care. "If it exists, and if it can be found, And if it can be filed, what would that take? Time, he said. And some risk. Risk to whom? To both of us. She looked up at that. He was watching her with that direct, serious expression that had not changed since he told her about the will, and she understood that he meant it. Not risk in the abstract, not risk as a word men use to sound measured, actual risk, the kind with consequences. Your stepsister's mother has connections I would prefer not to underestimate, he said. If she knows the document exists, she will move quickly to ensure it cannot surface, which means we would need to move more quickly than she does. We, she said. If you want. She looked at the fire for a moment. 3 years of silence. 3 years of folded hands and composed faces and swallowed words and rooms that did not want her. 3 years of believing that the shape of her life had been decided by her father's death, and there was nothing left to do but endure the shape. And now this, a document, a duke, a stepsister, whose hands had been on her back for 3 seconds on a dry and windless morning. There is something you are still not telling me, she said. She did not phrase it as an accusation. She said it plainly, because it was plain. He did not deny it. That was the thing that stopped her breath for just a moment. He did not deny it. He looked at her with that settled, weather-beaten expression, and something moved behind his eyes, something she still could not fully name, and he said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She walked to the door. She put her hand on it, and then stopped, because she was not a woman who left rooms without finishing what had been started. When you are ready to tell me the rest, she said, I expect you to do it plainly. She heard him exhale behind her. It was the smallest sound, almost nothing, but it was the first time since the cliff that he had made any sound at all that was not entirely controlled, and she filed it away, the way she had filed everything else about him, without yet knowing what it would mean. She opened the door. The cold came in, and behind her, in a voice that was quiet enough that it could have been meant only for himself, he said her name. Not Miss Ashvale, just Elowen. She did not turn around. She stepped out into the grey morning and pulled the door closed behind her, and she walked back toward the road, with her coat pulled tight and her mind running fast and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. The question was not whether she would trust him. The question was what it would cost her if she did. And what, she thought, as the birch trees closed behind her, it would cost her if she didn't. Lavinia was waiting by the carriage. She stood with her arms loose at her sides, and her face arranged into something that resembled concern, and she watched Elowen come down the road with the patience of a woman who had already decided how the conversation would go. That was always how Lavinia operated. She arrived at the end of things first, and then waited for everyone else to catch up. Elowen had spent 3 years catching up. She was done with that now. She reached the carriage and stopped in front of her stepsister and said nothing, because the first word belonged to whoever needed it most, and she did not need it. Lavinia looked at her hand, at the cloth, at the careful binding that spoke of someone else's attention and time. Something moved behind her eyes before she replaced it with softness. You found help, she said. I did. I was worried. When I could not find you on the path, I thought. What did you think, Lavinia? It was the tone that stopped her. Elowen had never used that tone with her before. Not in 3 years, not once, not even in the worst moments. She had always kept her voice even and her words measured, and her face arranged into the same careful blankness that made her easy to dismiss. She had hidden inside that blankness like a room with the curtains drawn, and she had done it deliberately, because a woman without visible edges gives her enemies nothing to grip. But she was done hiding. Not entirely, not recklessly, but she was done pretending she did not know what she knew. Lavinia tilted her head. You are upset. That is understandable. It was a frightening morning. Get in the carriage, Elowen said. She climbed in first and sat with her back straight and her bound hand resting on her knee and looked out the window at the road as the driver set them moving. Lavinia settled across from her with the small, self-possessed grace she brought to every room, and said nothing for a long while. And Elowen let the silence sit between them like something neither of them was going to name today. She was thinking about the document. She was thinking about her father sitting in some inn in the north during a bad storm, talking to a man he had just met about the daughter he was most afraid of failing. She was thinking about what it meant that he had written a revision and she had never known. She was thinking about the shape of the past 3 years, rearranging itself in the back of her mind. Every small cruelty and every calculated kindness and every door that had been quietly closed, all of it making new and terrible sense in light of one simple fact. They had known. Lavinia's mother had known what was in that document and had buried it before it could be filed. And Elowen had been living in that house for 3 years without understanding that the house itself should have been hers. She kept her face at the window. Lavinia spoke. "Who was the man on the path?" "A travailleur. He knew your name. Many people know my name. He looked at me," Lavinia said, "as though he knew mine." Elowen said nothing. The carriage moved through the village and out onto the wider road that ran between the low hills back toward the house, and Elowen watched the landscape move and kept her breathing steady and thought about timing, about how much Lavinia knew and how much she suspected, and how much time Elowen had before suspicion became action. The morning had not gone the way Lavinia planned. That meant she would plan something else. She was not a woman who abandoned objectives. She simply revised her approach quietly and quickly, and arrived at the end of things first. Elowen had, perhaps a day, maybe less. She needed to get back to Evander. That thought sat alongside all the others with a particular weight. She had left his door without agreeing to anything. She had walked out with her coat buttoned and her composure intact and had not looked back. And she had told herself that was the right thing, to take time, to think, to not give herself to the shape of something simply because she was desperate for it. But she was not sure she had time to be careful anymore. That evening she sat at the dinner table and ate what was placed in front of her, and listened to Lavinia's mother, Cordelia, speak about an upcoming gathering at a neighbouring estate. Cordelia was a woman built entirely for surfaces. She was impeccably dressed at all times, even in the mornings, even in rooms that contained no one worth impressing. She wore her graciousness like armour, and she directed it at Elowen with the particular precision of someone who understood that the most suffocating thing you could do to a person was to make them impossible to complain about. She had never struck Elowen. She had never raised her voice. She had simply ensured, year after year, that every small comfort and every small opportunity and every small opening in the world narrowed just enough to make it impossible for Elowen to move without permission. "Lord Fenwick's gathering is Saturday," Cordelia said, lifting her wine with effortless ease. "I have accepted on behalf of the household. Lavinia will wear the ivory. Elowen, I think the blue is still suitable." The blue was 4 years old. Lavinia's newest dress had arrived 3 weeks ago. "Of course," Elowen said. Lavinia looked at her across the table. The look was brief and unreadable and private, in the way that things exchanged between two people who have a history no one else can access are always private. It said nothing specific. It said everything Elowen needed to know. She excused herself early. In her room she sat at the edge of her bed in the dark and let herself feel the weight of the day properly for the first time. The cliff, the fall, his hand on her wrist, the fire, the name. Evander Croft, the Duke of Aldenmere, sitting in a small stone house, telling her that her father had tried to protect her and someone had unmade it before it could hold. She thought about what it would mean to fight for it. She was not a woman who had been given many fights that were winnable. She had learned to select carefully, to spend her energy only on things that had a reasonable return, because energy spent on losses was energy taken from survival. That calculus had kept her intact for 3 years. It had also kept her still. She did not want to be still anymore. She was awake before dawn. She dressed without lighting the lamp, moving through her room by memory, and she slipped out through the back door that the kitchen staff used in the early mornings before the household woke. The cold was sharp and clean. The sky was the deep blue of not quite morning, and the road was empty, and she walked it quickly with her hands in her pockets and her mind running ahead of her feet. He was already outside when she reached the stone house. He was standing in the small yard with a cup in his hand, looking at the tree line, and he turned at the sound of her on the path with an expression that was not surprised. He had expected her. Perhaps not this morning precisely, but soon, and he had been ready for it. That should have irritated her. It did not. "You left something unsaid yesterday," she told him. He nodded once. He opened the door, and she walked in, and the fire was already built, and she sat in the same chair, and he pulled the other one closer than the day before, and sat with his forearms on his knees, and looked at her directly. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The document is not missing," he said. "It was moved. I know where it is. It has been held by a solicitor in the city who took instruction from Cordelia Ashvale 3 years ago to secure it and make no disclosure. He is not a dishonest man." A pause. He was made afraid. She absorbed that. "Can it be retrieved?" "It can be compelled, through legal means, with the right authority behind the request." He met her eyes. "My authority would be sufficient." She looked at him. "Why would you do that?" And there it was again. The thing she had been circling since the cliff and had not been able to reach. She was asking it plainly now, in the grey light of an early morning, with no one around to hear the answer, and she was not going to let him sidestep it. He looked at the fire. "Your father," he said slowly, "asked me to look after it. The night at the inn. He was not entirely well. I understand that now. He knew he was not well, and I think he had begun to fear that things were not arranged the way he needed them to be. He asked me, a stranger, because there was no one else in the room, and the storm was not stopping." He paused. "I was not in a position to act immediately. By the time I was, he was already gone. And by the time I traced the document, it had already been moved. 8 months. He had spent 8 months trying to keep a promise made to a man in a storm who had died before he could know whether it had been kept. She felt something shift inside her chest, not the desperate grab of someone who had been offered a lifeline, something quieter, something that had to do with the specific and unbearable tenderness of a man sitting in an inn, talking about the daughter he was afraid of failing, and the other man across the table who had been a stranger and had listened anyway and had not let go of it. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in front of him. She had not cried about her father in a long time, and she was not going to start now in a borrowed chair at 5 in the morning, regardless of what her chest was doing. "You have been carrying this alone," she said. He looked back at her. "I did not think I had the right to bring it to you until I was sure. And now you are sure. Now I am sure. And now," he said, and his voice was quieter than it had been, "I think yesterday changed what is possible and what is not. If Cordelia knows you survived the cliff, she will act. She will move the document again, or she will find another way to close this before it can be opened." He held her gaze. "Which means if we are going to do this, we need to move now." She looked at him. This man, this stranger who was not quite a stranger anymore, who had known her father and kept his word across 8 months, and sat in the pre-dawn quiet of a cold morning and looked at her like she was not a complication but a reason. She thought about the cliff, about 3 years of blue dresses and narrowed doors and folded hands. She thought about what her father had sounded like, talking about her to a stranger in a storm, and the particular courage of a man who was afraid of failing and said so out loud. She made a decision. "I need one day," she said. "There are things in that house that I will not leave behind, and I need to understand fully what I am agreeing to before I agree to it." He nodded. One day. And then you tell me everything. Not what you think I need, everything. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face changed. Not opened, exactly, but unlocked. The way something unlocks when it has been holding itself closed for a long time, and someone has finally said the right thing. Everything, he said. She stood to leave, and he stood with her. And for a moment they were both standing in the small space between the two chairs, with the fire behind them and the grey morning pressing at the window. And she was close enough to see the faint line of that old scar at his wrist, and the way he was looking at her like she was both exactly what he had expected and nothing like it at all. She stepped back. One day, she said, and she left before either of them could do anything about the silence she left behind her. She spent the day like a woman who was not planning to leave. That was the performance required, and she gave it fully. She came down to breakfast at the usual hour and ate what was placed before her, and answered Cordelia's questions about the gathering on Saturday with the appropriate level of muted interest. She helped with the arrangement of flowers in the front room, which was a task assigned to her and not to Lavinia, because Cordelia had a fine sense for which labours built a person up and which ones quietly diminished them. She ironed her own blue dress and hung it on the door of her wardrobe, where it could be seen, and she moved through the house like someone whose plans extended no further than Saturday. Lavinia watched her. She always watched. But today the watching had a different quality to it, a sharpness underneath the surface calm, and Elowen felt it on her back the way you feel weather before it arrives. Something had shifted in Lavinia since the cliff. Not guilt. Lavinia did not carry guilt the way other people did. It was more like recalculation, like a plan that had needed adjusting and was now being adjusted, piece by careful piece. Elowen did not let herself rush. In the afternoon she went to her room, under the pretense of a headache, and she moved quickly and quietly. There were 3 things she would not leave behind. The small portrait of her mother that had lived on her windowsill since she was 7, and that Cordelia had never thought to take because it had no monetary value. A bundle of her father's letters tied with a cord that she kept under the loose board at the base of her wardrobe. And a document of her own, a record she had been keeping for 2 years in small and careful handwriting in a notebook that no one knew existed. Every instance of what had been done to her, and by whom, and when. Dates and words and small precise facts. The kind of record a woman makes when she understands that memory alone is not enough. She wrapped these 3 things inside a spare petticoat and put them in the bottom of her coat pocket and went back downstairs with her face calm and her hands steady. At dinner, Cordelia announced that she had received a visitor that afternoon. She said it lightly, the way she delivered all significant things, embedded in pleasantness so that the weight of them arrived late. She said a gentleman had called while Elowen was resting. A Mr. Harwick, she said, from the city, a solicitor. He had come to discuss a small matter of estate administration that she had already resolved. Nothing for anyone else to concern themselves with. Very routine. Elowen lifted her water glass and drank and set it down and did not let her hand shake. They knew, not about Evander specifically perhaps, but they knew something had moved. Cordelia would not have called the solicitor herself and revealed her hand unless she believed she needed to act before someone else did, which meant either she had been watching more carefully than Elowen had understood, or someone had told her something, or the cliff itself had been enough to convince her that the situation required acceleration. Either way, by morning the document would be gone. She excused herself after dinner and went upstairs and waited until the house went quiet. It took 2 hours. Cordelia kept late evenings when she was unsettled, which she disguised as reading, and Lavinia's light stayed on longer than usual, and Elowen sat in her chair in the dark and measured the silence in intervals and did not move until she was certain. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she took the 3 things from her pocket and held them for a moment, the small weight of what remained of her father's world, and she walked out of that house for the last time. The road was cold and moonlit. She did not run. Running was for women who had not planned, and she had planned. She walked quickly and steadily, and the road gave back the sound of her boots in a rhythm that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like it was going somewhere. He was awake. The light was on in the stone house, and when she knocked he opened the door within moments, fully dressed, and he looked at her face and then at the set of her shoulders, and he stepped back without a word and let her in. "They called the solicitor today," she said. "Cordelia. He came to the house this afternoon. She is moving the document." He was already at the small writing desk in the corner. "I know," he said. "I had word this afternoon." She stared at him. "From whom?" "I have had someone watching the house." He looked up, met her expression. "Not you. The house. I told you there was risk. Watching is how I manage risk." She absorbed this. She wanted to object to it, on principle, and she could not find the principled objection that outweighed the usefulness of the information. She filed that tension away and focused. "Can we still reach it?" she said. "If we leave within the hour." She looked at him. "The solicitor's office is in the city," he said, already moving. "Harwick will not transfer the document until morning. He is careful, and careful men do not make significant transfers in the night. But if I appear at his door before he can act, with the legal authority I hold, and a witness to the original instruction, he will have no legitimate ground to refuse disclosure." "What witness?" He paused. "There was a clerk," he said, "present when Cordelia first brought the document to Harwick, a young man who has since left that office. I found him 4 months ago. He has agreed to come forward." She stared at him. 4 months ago. He had found a witness 4 months ago, and had held all of it, building the case piece by piece, with the same quiet, methodical care he applied to everything, and he had not come to her until he was certain. She thought about what it would have meant if he had come to her earlier, half-built, before she had any ground to stand on, before the cliff had stripped away whatever remained of her willingness to stay still. She thought about whether she would have believed him, or trusted him, or had the courage to move. She was not entirely sure she would have. "You timed it," she said. He held her gaze. "I waited until I had enough to protect you, not just to inform you." A pause. "There is a difference." There was. She knew there was. And she also knew that she did not have time to sit with all the things that meant. So she pushed them to the back of her mind and kept her eyes on the work in front of her. "Then let us go," she said. They rode through the night. He had 2 horses ready, which told her that this departure had been anticipated, regardless of what she chose, that he had prepared for the version of the morning where she came to him, and the version where she did not, and she found something steadying in that, not because she wanted to be managed, but because she understood the difference between a man who prepared for your choices and a man who made them for you, and this was the former. The city was 2 hours on a good road. They did not speak much. The cold was serious, and the dark was full, and there was something about moving at speed in the direction of something that made words feel like the wrong tool. She rode beside him, and the road unwound beneath them, and she thought about the document, and about Cordelia, and about the small portrait of her mother, wrapped inside a petticoat in her coat pocket. She thought about her father in an inn in the north. She thought about a man she had not yet met, sitting across from him in a storm, listening. They reached the city as the sky was beginning to consider grey. Harwick lived above his office, which was a narrow building on a respectable street that looked like exactly what it was, a place where careful men kept things other people needed to believe were safe. Evander knocked, and there was a long pause, and then a light appeared in the upper window, and then the sound of bolts being drawn. Harwick was a small man in his 60s, with the look of someone who had spent his life being trusted and had found it more exhausting than expected. He opened the door, saw Evander, and went very still. "Your Grace," he said. "Mr. Harwick." Evander's voice was even and quiet, and carried the precise weight of a man who required no performance of authority, because his authority was simply a fact. "I believe we have a matter to discuss." They were inside within minutes. The conversation was not long. Evander was calm and exact. He named the document. He named the date. He named Cordelia Ashvale, and the instruction she had given, and the clerk who had been present, and he placed before the solicitor a signed affidavit from that clerk that Elowen had not known existed until he produced it from inside his coat and laid it on the desk with the flat certainty of a man who had prepared for every version of this conversation. Harwick looked at the affidavit. He looked at Evander. He looked at Elowen for the first time since they had entered, and his expression did something complicated, something that moved through several stages and arrived at something that might have been relief. He had been afraid, Evander had said, not dishonest. And looking at him now, Elowen believed it. He was a man who had been given a terrible instruction and had not known how to undo it, and someone had just shown him the door. He went to the inner office. He came back with a document. It was not dramatic in its appearance. Paper, ink, a seal at the bottom in her father's hand. She looked at it, and her vision did something that she controlled with considerable effort, and she kept her face still and her breathing even, and she read the words that her father had written 3 months before he died. He had left her everything, the house, the land, the accounts, all of it in her own name, with full legal standing, exactly as Evander had said. Edmund Ashvale had known he was running out of time, and he had tried to fix it, and someone had taken that from her, and she had spent 3 years not knowing, and now she knew. She folded the document carefully and held it against her chest for exactly 3 seconds, and then she put it in her coat pocket beside her mother's portrait. She turned to find Evander watching her. There was nothing practiced in his expression now. It was plain and unguarded, and full of something she recognized, because she felt it herself, the particular exhaustion of arriving at the end of a long effort and finding that the thing you were working toward was real. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly, as though the thanks were aimed at the wrong place. "Your father asked me to look after it." "You looked after more than it," she said. He was quiet. The grey light was coming in properly now through the small window above the desk, and she could see him clearly in it. And she thought about all the versions of this morning she had imagined on the road, the confrontations, the complications, the things that might have gone wrong. None of them had prepared her for the specific quiet of standing in a solicitor's office at dawn with the document in her pocket and this man in front of her, and nothing left to fear today. She crossed the space between them. She did not think about it. She had been thinking about things too carefully for too long, and she was done with careful for this particular moment. She put her hand against his chest, flat, the way you put your hand against something to confirm it is real, and he looked down at her with an expression that was very still and very present, and asked nothing of her. She looked up at him. "I do not know what comes next," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you know where you stand now." "Yes," she said, "I do." He put his hand over hers, not pulling, just resting, like something that had been reaching for something for a very long time and had finally arrived and was in no hurry to let go. Outside, the city was waking. The house was hers. Her father had not failed her, and the man who had kept his word across 8 months of silence was standing in the early morning light with his hand over hers, and she let herself feel that without qualifying it, without folding it down to a manageable size, without deciding in advance what it was allowed to mean, it meant something. That was enough for now. That was, in fact, everything. They left the solicitor's office as the city opened around them. The streets were beginning to fill with the early morning kind of people, the ones who belonged to the hours before the rest of the world arrived. Delivery carts, bakers. A woman sweeping a step with the focused indifference of someone who had done it every morning for 20 years. Elowen walked beside Evander and felt the document against her ribs with every step, and thought that this was what returned things felt like. Not loud, not triumphant, just present the way something is present when it has finally stopped being absent. They did not go back immediately. He stopped at a small establishment near the end of the street that was just unlatching its door, the kind of place that served strong tea and bread to working people at hours that most establishments had not yet considered. And he held the door, and she walked in, and they sat at a corner table by the window and ordered without looking at each other, and then sat in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and are still finding the edges of it. She wrapped her hands around the cup when it came. The tea was too hot to drink properly, and she drank it anyway. She will know by morning, Elowen said. Cordelia. When Harwick does not deliver as planned, she will know something has changed. Yes. And then she will do what she always does. She will make it look like something else. She looked out the window at the street. She is very good at that. Now, she will not have much to work with, Evander said. The document is legal and witnessed, and now in the hands of its rightful owner. Her leverage was the secrecy. Without the secrecy, she has a great deal of explaining to do, and not many explanations available to her. Elowen turned her cup slowly between her palms. She will try to discredit it. She will try, he agreed. And she will find that significantly more difficult with the Duke of Aldenmere prepared to appear in any courtroom she chooses, and describe the chain of custody in considerable detail. She looked at him. He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without decoration, like a fact being placed on a table rather than a favour being offered. But it was a favour. It was an enormous favour, and they both knew it, and she did not know yet how to carry that gracefully. You did not have to do this, she said. Your father asked me. My father asked a stranger in a storm. You could have forgotten it by morning. Most people would have. He looked at her steadily. I am not most people. She believed him. She had believed him since the cliff, which was the thing she had been trying not to admit to herself, because belief without ground is dangerous, and she had learned that at considerable cost. But there was ground here. 8 months of it, built quietly, held patiently, produced at the right moment, not for effect, but because the moment required it. She finished her tea. Outside, the city was fully awake now. The grey sky had warmed to something almost white, the particular light of early English mornings that was not beautiful exactly, but was honest, the kind of light that showed everything as it actually was. I need to go back to the house, she said. He looked at her. Not to stay, she said. There are things that need to be said in person and in daylight. Cordelia has known me as a dependent for 3 years. She needs to understand that I am not one any more, and she needs to understand it from me directly, in that house, in that room, while she can still see me clearly. She paused. I will not let her learn it through intermediaries, and spend the next month constructing a version of events that suits her. He was quiet for a moment. You want to face her yourself. I have been letting other people arrange the truth around me for 3 years. I am done with that. She met his eyes. Will you come? He did not hesitate. Yes. They rode back as the morning fully arrived. She thought about what she was going to say, and then stopped thinking about it, because the things that needed saying were not the kind that benefited from rehearsal. They were the kind that needed to come out plainly, from the place where plain things live, and rehearsing them gave them a shape that did not fit. She thought instead about her father. She thought about him sitting in that study, with his books he never quite finished, and his good intentions, and his poor judgment. And she thought about him sitting across from a stranger in a storm, and saying her name out loud to someone who might listen. She thought about what it had cost him to know he was running out of time, and to do the only thing he could think of, which was to write it down, and hope and trust a stranger. She hoped he had known, somehow, that the stranger had not let go. The house came into view at the end of the road, familiar and terrible, and smaller than it had always felt from the inside. It was a fine house. The grounds were well kept. It was the kind of house that looked, from any road, like the home of people who had built something solid. She knew what it had been built on. She was not going to carry it anymore. Cordelia was in the front room when they walked in. She was sitting with a book open in her lap that she was not reading, and she looked up when the door opened with the expression of a woman who had been waiting and had prepared for several versions of what the waiting might bring. She looked at Elowen and then at the man behind her, and something moved through her face that was not quite fear and not quite recognition. It was something between them, the particular expression of a person who has been holding a card and has just realized the other hand is stronger. She stood. "Elowen," she said, "who is your companion?" Lavinia appeared in the doorway from the hall. She saw Evander and went very still. She knew, Elowen realized. Lavinia had seen something on that path, had seen enough, and she had told her mother, and her mother had moved quickly, and none of it had been quick enough. Elowen crossed the room and stood in the centre of it, in the blue dress that was 4 years old, and she put her hands at her sides, and she looked at the woman who had spent 3 years narrowing every door. "I have my father's will," she said. The revision, dated 3 months before his death, signed and witnessed, and now in my possession, along with an affidavit from the clerk, who was present when you instructed Mr. Harwick to conceal it. She kept her voice even, not cold, even. There was a difference. Cold was performance. Even was simply the truth arriving in a reasonable tone. I am not here to argue about it. The legal position is established. I am here to tell you directly that I will be taking possession of this house within the week, and I am giving you this time in person because my father would have wanted that, and because I am choosing to be the kind of woman he believed I was. The room was very quiet. Cordelia's face had gone through several things and arrived at something closed and controlled. She was a woman of surfaces, and the surface was holding, but underneath it, Elowen could see the precise and careful adjustment happening, the rapid reassessment, the search for an angle. There was no angle. "This is a considerable claim," Cordelia said. Her voice was impressively steady. "I would want my own counsel to review any documents before—" "Of course," Elowen said. "You are welcome to engage whoever you wish. It will not change what the documents say." She paused. "I am not asking for your agreement, Cordelia. I am informing you of the situation." Lavinia had not moved from the doorway. Elowen looked at her. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about what she would want to say, and what she was owed, and what it would feel like to say it. She had imagined sharp words and clean exits, and the particular satisfaction of a door closing behind her on her own terms. What she felt, standing here, looking at her stepsister, was something quieter and more complicated. Lavinia was a woman who had been trained by her mother to use every available tool, and Elowen had been an available tool, and Lavinia had used her the way she had been taught. That was not forgiveness. It was not excusing the cliff, or the 3 years, or the small daily cruelties administered with such care and plausible deniability. But it was the truth, and she was choosing to deal only in truth now. "I do not hate you," Elowen said. "I think that is worse for you than if I did. But I will not be in the same room with you and pretend that I have forgotten what happened on that path." She let that sit for exactly a moment. "You should know that I am not the only one who knows." Lavinia's jaw tightened. That was all. Just the jaw. She was her mother's daughter. Elowen turned and walked back across the room. She felt Evander fall in beside her as she reached the door, not guiding, not intervening, simply present, the way he had been present since the cliff, steady and adjacent. They walked out into the morning. She did not look back at the house. She had looked back at things for long enough. They stood on the road, and she breathed the clean, cold air and felt the document against her ribs, and looked at the white sky above the trees, and let herself exist in the space after something enormous, without immediately filling it with the next thing. He stood beside her. "How do you feel?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Like something heavy has been put down." She paused. "And also like I have not slept in a very long time. He made a sound that was quiet and genuine and constituted, she was fairly certain, the closest thing to a real laugh she had heard from him, which was a small and unremarkable thing, and which she found herself turning over in her mind with something that felt dangerously like warmth. She looked at him. In the daylight, away from firesides and crisis, he was simply himself, the hard jaw and the settled expression, and the eyes that held their attention without demanding anything in return. He was looking at her with something that had moved past careful and past measured, and had arrived at something she recognized, because she had felt its reflection in herself for days now, something that did not yet have a name between them, but was becoming harder to address as anything else. What happens now? She said. For the house, the legal process takes several weeks. Harwick will file the revision formally. Cordelia's counsel will review and find nothing useful to contest. The transfer will proceed. He paused. For everything else, he looked at her steadily. That depends on what you want. She looked down the road. The birch trees were visible at the far end, silver and bare in the morning light, the path that ran past them disappearing over the hill in the direction of a cliff she had gone over 4 days ago in a life that felt like it belonged to a different woman. She thought about what she wanted. She had not asked herself that question in years. She had been asking what was survivable and what was manageable and what was the minimum required to keep herself intact. She had forgotten that those were not the same question. I want to go home, she said. Not to that house, to something that is actually mine, she paused. And I want to do it without being afraid. He nodded, quiet. And I want, she said, and her voice was smaller now, not because she was uncertain, but because some things are said quietly, simply because they are true, to stop doing all of it alone. He was still for a moment. Then he turned to face her fully, and he looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the solicitor's office, unguarded and plainly present, and he said, Then you will not. She looked at him. 3 words. No embellishment, no performance, no careful distance. Just the plain shape of a man who had kept a promise across 8 months to a dying stranger and had been quiet about it, and who was now standing in the morning light saying the truest thing he knew how to say. She nodded once. It was not a beginning, exactly. It was too built for that. It was something that had been built quietly and slowly in firesides and stone houses and pre-dawn roads and solicitors' offices, built out of shared truth and plain speech, and the particular way 2 people move through a crisis together when neither of them is pretending. It was something real, and real was enough, more than enough. She turned, and they walked together down the road, and the morning was cold, and the sky was white, and the birch trees stood silver in the distance, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, like the road ahead of her was one she had chosen. She did not know everything that was coming. She knew Cordelia would not let this rest quietly, that the legal process would surface things that had been buried, that the weeks ahead would ask more of her than this morning had. She knew that she and this man were at the beginning of something neither of them had finished understanding yet, and that the next steps would require honesty she was still learning to allow herself. But she knew she was not afraid. She knew her father had tried, and she knew that the stranger he had trusted in a storm was walking beside her now on a cold English morning, unhurried and present, with all the patience in the world. That was enough to go on with. That was, she thought, an enormous amount to go on with. Now, before you go, drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved something in you, hit that subscribe button. You clearly feel stories deeply, and there are many more waiting for you right here.